Oh boy. Okay, so I'm gonna be blunt with you guys. I expected this. I didn't expect it so out in the open. I expected the general sentiment that Trump is about to express to be his general sentiment. I just thought he would be smart enough not to say this in public, considering how it could affect leverage in negotiations, and of course how it could affect public perception due to the fact that the vast majority of Americans still support Ukraine and a majority of Americans still support aid to Ukraine. But I asked too much of the Lord, and he punished me for asking too much. And Donald Trump decided to go on Sean Hannity program to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. But once the topic of Ukraine and Russia came up and making a deal, somehow Trump was able to start off talking about the possibility of deal making and then pivot off into blaming Ukraine for resisting and Zelensky for the war. Not solely Zelensky, but him as well, and Ukraine for fighting against such a big country. We'll watch this. We'll talk about the mentality, how it could affect U.S. policy, and let's just watch it, because I expected this in like private meeting rooms with his advisors, not on Fox News.
You put out a truth on Vladimir Putin today.
Yeah. It's too fast. It's sped up. There we go.
You seem to have had a relationship with him and you've talked about ending this war in Europe, and you want to end it quickly. How quickly can it end?
Should end immediately. Should have never started. That would never have started if I used to talk to Putin about it. Ukraine was the apple of his eye, but there was no chance that he would ever do it, and he didn't do it. For 4 years, he didn't do it.
Have you spoken?
So let's do this all in segments. And I know I'm going to be talking a lot, but Trump says stuff so reductively and so quickly and moves on. And he says these slogans so often that they just kind of, they kind of almost mold into his language, almost like it's a cough or a sneeze, just almost like it's just a natural reflection, less a point. But the idea that the war wouldn't have happened with him. And I've been making this point a lot on my show recently. I make this point a lot before at the time, and I'll make this point again because I really need to drive this point home. People, if you think that Trump just being in office would have been enough to stop the Russians from invading or to intimidate them away from it, you've got another thing coming. And I think you're completely off base. I think, number one, it doesn't add up with what Donald Trump said in the second part of this, and we'll get into that in a moment, which is that Ukraine is, and I quote from Donald Trump, the apple of Putin's eye. Doesn't sound that much like, hey, we're really concerned about, NATO expand. That sounds more like it's ideological, imperial. It's like what Putin's writing in those essays and publishing as president when he has no reason to be publishing essays as a multiple decade president. It might actually be what he believes. But Donald Trump, when he says like he would have been able to stop the war by being in there, it doesn't take into account, number one, point two he made about Putin seeing it as the apple of his eye. But the other point is they thought the war would be over in a week. And if you think the war is going to be over in a week, then what does it matter if Trump threatens to send $1 bajillion in aid? The Ukrainians are going to welcome them with open arms, and the ones that don't, they're going to get crushed by mighty Russia. And if you believe that, and the Russians sent few enough troops that it seems that they really did believe that, then I don't understand what like a little bit of scarier Trump would have done if there would have been like, oh, Trump will send double the aid. Trump might actually do an airstrike or two in Ukraine. That doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And for the 4 years Trump was in office, he didn't signal a shift in U.S. policy towards Ukraine. A continuation of the same Obama-Biden failure when it comes up to 2022 Biden, of course, because the war marked a key shift. Point is, I've never been convinced of that. I've never been convinced of that. As for the second thing he says here,
I would never have started if I used to talk to Putin about it. Ukraine was the apple of his eye. But
isn't it interesting that Trump can see it? Trump can see that, oh, wait, he actually just wants Ukraine. He wants Ukraine because he believes Ukraine is a part of Russia. He believes it's part of its empire. He believes it's an extension of the Ruski Mir. And everything he writes in the essays is not just like a flowery way of putting issues of hard economic power, because either if you're like a Marxist, all you could do is analyze everything through a pure materialist lens. There's just a level of pure nationalist revanchism here. It might be harder to see them viewing the world differently than you, but he does view the world differently than you. And his version of the world is Ukraine doesn't exist, Russia has a right to this land, and all of the civil liberties that Ukrainians want all are a facade and don't really matter to us anyway. And so Trump can see that, like, Ukraine, the apple of his eye. He can see it. He can state it. He says it so simply. And while much of the time when Trump speaks and he talks simply, it's reductionist. In this instance, I mean, I think that's the perfect way to put it. He sees Ukraine as the apple of his eye. It is the necessary first step if he wants to move on anywhere else. Moldova. If he wants to feel confident to make moves in Georgia, or make moves to get back into Armenia, or to make moves in anywhere else in Europe, if he was to, try to push up against any current NATO state. Point is, like, Trump just calling it as simply as it is here, I kind of hit something for me.
But there was no
I'll try not to be a super posh champ, but I'm going to be one.
Chance that he would ever do it. And he didn't do it. For 4 years, he didn't do it.
Have you spoken to him?
I don't want to say, but I will tell you, it's got to end. And if you look at I'm just talking from a human life. I don't care, Russia, Ukraine, US. These are human beings that are just being slaughtered on this battlefield.
I really don't know if he cares at all. And when I mean that, I mean on like any level. And I'm saying I don't know to be charitable, because I think I know, but I'm going to say I don't know because I really can't know. But this was the guy who said we need to kill the families of terrorists, bomb the children, bomb the wives, bomb the families in order to get a message across to them. This is the, fire and fury guy. He increased drone strikes and restricted the data on them. He is not particularly dovish in comparison to his contemporaries, especially if the issues where people think he was dovish on, for example, the Middle East. He supported the Iraq invasion until it went bad, then he was against it. He went with the wind, just like he was for state in Syria, then he was against it, then he was for it again, then he was against it again. Just flipping from reasons as silly as the Kurds weren't with us as Normandy to as blatant and as imperialistic as I want the oil in Syria, in comparison to the usual reason, which is to stop the Shia crescent to Lebanon.
By the millions.
I just find it very difficult to believe that this is really the view that he takes on it, rather than trying to grab onto a popular, narrative or grab onto something that of course people are sympathetic to the amount of people that are dying, because I just don't think he's acted with that in mind. For example, the stopping of the aid during the Battle of Avdiivka, I do not think that took people's lives into consideration, because the Ukrainians lost a lot of lives during that for no really good reason. Aid should have been blocked for no real good reason.
They've already died in cities. The cities are like demolition sites. Many people died. One thing with the Ukraine war, you're going to find many more people died than think. This is a war that should have never started. Biden did a hard...
He would make up numbers on the campaign trail for deaths in Ukraine. And the thing is, there's plenty of death and destruction of Ukraine to get across the point that this is a brutal war, this is an awful war, this is a terribly destructive war. You don't need to make up numbers. And he talk about millions upon millions. He'll just throw out random numbers the numbers are much higher than that, what they actually tell you. He's like, I see what the Ukrainians report, and what the Ukrainians report is that the Russians are near 1 million casualties. What the Russians report are physically impossible. It's we've taken out triple the amount of aircraft that Ukraine has ever had. But none of those estimates, even if you take the outlandish ones, get to where Trump is saying. He's just blowing the numbers out of proportion in order to emphasize a high stakes, a high amount of loss to get this point across clearer. But if he really cared, why would he be lying about the numbers? Why not just say, a lot of people are dying, or use the real numbers instead of making it up on the campaign trail? Same thing when it comes to I want the United States to not have to pay as much and want Europe to pay more. If that's the case, say the real numbers. Don't keep saying that we're paying more than Europe when Europe is paying more than us. And it's been true for like well over a year and a half now.
Horrible, horrible job in allowing that war to start. It should have never started. It would have never started. It wasn't even tough from that standpoint. One thing.
Wasn't even tough. It was a frozen war where the Russians occupied Crimea and 1/3 of 2 other regions. And you acknowledge that it's the apple of his eye, and it's aggressive, and there's like spats of fire. What do you mean it's not? It is actively tough. That's the reason it is frozen and not solved is for that reason. If it wasn't, then maybe, I mean, I guess his sale would have been easy for me to solve this, but now that I'm in office, ooh, it's so difficult. Even though just on the campaign trail, he was saying 24 hours, 24 hours, 24 hours. And here he is in office. It's like he never made the promise. And now he's saying, oh, I could have solved it before. Bitch, you said you'd solve it this time. You didn't say, we don't need you to be president 4 years ago. Nobody voted for you to be president 4 years ago when they just went to the booth. They voted for you to be president right now. You said you were going to end the war right now. That's what you said in 24 hours, over and over and over again. And it's just going to be like the wall and make the Mexicans pay for it. Well, he didn't actually mean the Mexicans pay for it. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Stop making excuses for him.
So he allowed energy to go up, way up. If he brought it down, the war wouldn't have started because Putin wouldn't have had the money. Putin makes all his money on energy.
Here's another thing. This is true that the lower you make energy prices, the worse it is for the Russians because their state and Gazprom is heavily reliant on the amount they can sell a barrel of oil for their state coffers to stay afloat. And even with that, they still have had to cannibalize the commercial banking sector. And I mean, I don't need to go into all of the economic problems, but they're dealing with still a ton of economic problems. And the less these exported fuels can be sold for, the worse of a position they're going to be in, and the more they're going to have to cannibalize the commercial banking sector, which is going to make it harder and harder and harder for these banks to take loans that, I mean, it's going to be almost impossible for the government to pay back in the near future if they can ever pay it back in the first place. So it is true, but also we're energy independent. We're currently energy independent. We're producing more fuel and gas than at any point in human history, in the history of the United States or the history of any country on the face of the planet, and no other country's close. And that amount is only increasing. And the amount of liquefied natural gas export terminals that was being built during the Biden administration is going to increase the amount of export terminals currently in construction by like 50%. And the hold that was put in place on constructing new ones is probably about to be revoked, so that number is even going to go higher. And we're making up the European energy sector as the Russians lose their 35% stake in the energy sector in Europe. So when I hear like, oh, we could have just produced it, that's what we did. That's exactly what we did. What he's describing is what Biden ended up doing. He, the person who was talking about, you know, who happened to invest the most in green energy of any president in human history, also is exporting the most energy of any president in U.S. history. These two things are true at the same time. It's just that, I guess, since Biden's like the hippie green president, people just assume he also didn't produce a lot of fuel or didn't drill, baby drill, but he actually did allow a lot of drilling. He actually did allow quite a lot of drilling. You don't get those types of numbers unless you do.
And Biden let it go to...
So, I mean, like, all that Trump can really do now is bleed a stone. And I mean, I'm sure he can find some more blood and maybe he can bring the price down a little bit and then we'll add some more pressure. But when he talks about like putting tariffs on the Russians, that's not going to do anything. Tariffs on the Russians, it's just him throwing out a campaign buzzword as an attack now. It really seems like Trump doesn't have any method to really bring the Russians to the table that he's willing to wag around. I mean, I heard before like threatening more weapons, but the only thing he's really threatened of any significance is more sanctions at this point. And I mean, more sanctions on Russia. Okay, Anthony Blinken. Okay, Jake Sullivan. Okay, Joe Biden. I've seen this before. I mean, that's not a real I don't know how that would shift the situation so much. You would need to pair multiple things together. A threat of increased sanctions on top of a threat of coordinating, for example, with the South Koreans more to ship even more artillery shells, send more aid overall to add the pressure so that they'll have to take an even worse deal a year down the line. Better to take the better deal now with less debt. This is how you do. You don't just out-sanction you more. And I mean, unless there's something else going on behind the scenes by more competent statesmen, say, and this is a low standard, mind you, being a more competent statesman in this matter, but maybe Marco Rubio, I don't know, even though no, he was confirmed. He was confirmed 99-0. When I believe the one vote that was like not a yes was, I believe, Bernie's, and it was like no contest or something. Point is, though,
the money. Putin makes all his money on energy.
The point is, like, the energy dominance question is always been silly when Trump talks about this, because Biden did exactly what he asked of him. It's just he'll never get credit for it because he's the green hippie Democrat. And in fact, I know many environmental activists who don't like Biden because of the very thing I'm talking about right now. And so not only does Biden not get the credit for the energy independence and producing the most energy of any American administration in history and exporting the most energy of any American president administration in American history, but they also don't get the credit for the massive amount, the historic amount of green energy investments that have been made because of the first. So nobody's happy. Nobody's happy.
Biden let it go to a record, and Putin had so much money he was able to do it. So, but that's only one thing. That wasn't even the biggest reason.
Yeah, it's not that. I don't know what he's talking about, because we like froze the Russian assets. They can't access those assets to have, like, what could have Biden done to, like, for example, take Russian assets, hand it over to Ukrainians, could have been stronger. Get the aid to the Ukrainians quicker, stronger. When you talk about the financial angle to it, like, the only thing I would say is that the sanctions should have been put in place quicker, that there was a slow burn. But I mean, at the start, I didn't even think Germany would agree to the SWIFT expulsion. So I remember at the start I was surprised just by that. So how much more quickly could he have asked for that? And plus he would have to coordinate it. Trump would have had to coordinate the sanction pressure with the rest of Europe. Maybe he could have done it. Maybe somebody around him could have done it. But I don't know who would that have been? 2022 Trump administration, another 2 years. We don't even know what type of turnover the Trump administration would have saw if it went to a second administration, 2 years, 2022. I have no clue.
What was said at the time was so bad. I said, he's going to drive that guy into doing this.
A minor incursion.
So to be clear, Biden should have threatened more or did more economic pressure, and Biden's going to force them into doing this. What do you mean force them into doing it? How? He didn't bomb them. He didn't invade them. He didn't even sanction them in advance of an invasion. It was, I mean, all they really did was send the weapons and give the intelligence to the Ukrainians, or some weapons at the start. Low cost javelins, stuff like that. AT-4s. So what does he mean? Like he pushed him? What was the push? The fact that he exposed that he was going to invade in advance? The fact that he didn't do sanctions? Because if the critique is he wasn't strong enough in the face of the Russian invasion, I mean, okay, I could agree they could have been stronger in some areas. I would agree with that critique, but it's all in areas that I would want him to be stronger that Trump was equally weak on. Same with Obama. Actually, Obama probably worse.
He used the word minor incursion. That was bad, but he said things worse than that. And Putin shouldn't have done it, too. I mean, I'm not blaming the only one. Putin shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have done it, and it has to stop. Do you know they've lost about 850,000 Russian soldiers and 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers?
Where does he get these numbers? What these numbers are fucking the highest estimates that anybody hears of. 800. Okay, so the 850,000 number, I think, comes from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And it is true that it is likely that the Russians could hit 1 million casualties this year. And that number, I guess, is physically possible, but it's the highest estimate. So he's going with the highest possible Russian estimate, that it's like literally the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense number. So he's taken the Zelensky state media line, And then on the other side, the 700,000 number, I have no clue where he got that for the Ukrainians. I mean, I've heard 300,000. Of course, I know the official numbers that the Ukrainians are putting out is not fully up to date. They don't update it often, probably for morale reasons. But 700,000 is not a number I've heard, and I don't even know how that would be produced. If it was a 1-to-1 ratio, that for every one Russian soldier that died, one Ukrainian soldier died, I just don't think it would be mathematically possible for the Ukrainians to even be holding the line at this point. Because it's not just like you become a casualty and you get taken away, and that's the only way you lose troops. You lose troops to rotations and people retiring. You lose troops to people going through like mental breakdowns or non-combat related injuries, aging out of service, that they just become too unhealthy or aged out of it. People just like fulfill their service and they don't need to come back. Desertion skyrocket. So if I add all of those other problems on top of 700,000 casualties, I don't know if these are like the type of casualties where you get some glass in your shin, and so that's counted as a casualty, and so like you could return like 3 or 4 times, but the numbers just don't add up. But his numbers on Ukraine has never added up. So I mean, I feel like I'm kind of just in the tar pushing around right now, fighting for no good reason.
And the Ukraine has been devastated.
Devastated.
Will it be a negotiated settlement, and will you lead the negotiation?
Well, I hope so. And I put out a truth today that's really strong, and I mean it. And if they don't do that, I'm going to put...
Really? That's how he's talking about? I'm sorry. I've never heard him refer to it, actually. I call it, is it a truth? I would say as a joke. He actually just refers to them as truths. So Trump has a social media website called Truth Social, and he posts there and most of the time, and that's where people get updates. And I didn't know did he really just call them truths? By the way, Truth Social, what a name. But truths, really? I thought it would just be like, I made a post, but no, he just calls them truths. Very catchy. I put out a truth. Very 1984. When the president posts, he posts truths.
Settlement, and will you lead the negotiation?
Well, I hope so. And I put out a truth today that's really strong, and I mean it. And if they don't do that, I'm going to put massive
If
tariffs.
They don't do what?
If they don't settle this war soon, like almost immediately, I'm going to put massive tariffs on Russia.
That means nothing, dude. I mean, he might as well, like, I'm gonna write grr, screw you, Russia, on a balloon and drop tariffs. Sanctions, okay. You could try to do, for example, sanctions on the countries that are facilitating the export of American. For example, we export stuff to Kyrgyzstan, and then people take from Kyrgyzstan, bring it to Russia. Oh, you're going to sanction those countries to make it so, yeah, you're layering the sanctions, making it harder to get stuff through. See, that's how you try to progress a more aggressive sanction policy. Or you tell, like, banks, for example, if we see you doing business with these Russian companies trying to facilitate finances or weapons or supplies, well, then guess what, buddy? You are not going to be able to do business in the United States. And California itself has a larger budget, a larger GDP than Russia. So you're going to lose access to the entire American market. Like this is how you do a sanctions campaign. Right, and you constantly have to kind of chase the mouse, everywhere. You just have to.
Burns is an immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Tariffs. I mean, okay, I guess the Russians will be disincentivized for trading their barley and their vodka and their products with the United States right now. I'm sure those American consumers who have to pay extra for Russian product, but tariff, no, you would sanctions. That, I mean, at least he mentioned that in other locations. Sanctions would be the economic pressure you would want to apply. He's just trying to use the tariff buzzword as much as possible to make it the hip new trendy thing. Snap. Tariff here, tariff there. We're going to tariff everything. This isn't what a tariff would be used to solve. This is not a policy problem that can be solved by tariffs. Maximus 1975. Sorry, I ignored all those gift memberships. I was just trying to get my point across. Thank you so much for the gift memberships to Edward Langton, Lunar Blood TT, Dankster, William Young, and Ronan Levisk. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, buddy. You didn't need to do that. Not that I'm discouraging that, of course. In fact, I would say that, you know, it'd be really nice if that started a trend where everyone gave me their money.
And massive taxes and also big sanctions. And I don't want to do that. You know, I love the Russian people. They're great people. I don't want to do that, but we got to get this war ended. And if they don't make a settlement like fast, and Zelensky, I will say this, he wants to settle now. He's had enough. He shouldn't have allowed this to happen either.
No.
You know, if he's no angel, he shouldn't have allowed this war to happen. First of all, he's fighting a much bigger entity. Okay, much bigger. When he was, you know, talking so brave and so, now two things happened. They were brave, but we gave them billions of dollars. The United States spent $200 billion more than Europe. Why did we spend more? You know why? Because Biden never asked Europe to spend more. They spent 200.
It became a U.S.-Russia proxy war because of Joe.
Zelensky was fighting a much bigger entity, much bigger, much more powerful. He shouldn't have done that because we could have made a deal, and it would have been a deal that would have been, it would have been a nothing deal. I could have made that deal so easily. And Zelensky decided that I want to fight, you know, they have 30,000 army tanks. Russia has 30,000 army tanks. Zelensky had none, practically. You don't fight those. Now, then we started pouring equipment, pouring. And they had the bravery to use the equipment. But in the end, that's a war has to be settled. So the field is...
There's more here, and we're going to listen to it in a second. But we got to approach that, where he starts to like praise Zelensky because Zelensky is willing to make a deal, and he's been open to Trump in his conversations with him about making a deal to end a war. But then he turns around and then says, but he's not innocent either, and he should have stopped the war. And then the justification to why Zelensky is also at fault for this war is that when the Russians invaded, they happened to be a bigger country. Now, Russia happens to be the biggest country on the planet, mind you. So this would be true of literally any country that would go to war with Russia, is that Russia would be the much bigger country. And Ukraine is also in that position. And so because it's the bigger country, instead, what Zelensky should have done is just waited for a deal to be made. And if Trump was president, then he could have made a deal and then he wouldn't have fought. But this is the thing I don't get. Even let's play in the fantasy where Zelensky, all he had to do was sit there as the Russian tanks marched in and Trump just did his magic. Trump wasn't president. Even if this delusion that Trump was such an amazing deal maker, even though he can't use that magic now, that he could have just gone up to the Russians and like gotten a deal out of them that would be so good for the Ukrainians that they might as well not even resist and fight. Even though I would just throw out there, if the Ukrainians show no will to fight, then there's going to be no fighting against the Russians, then there's going to be no leverage because they haven't shown that they're willing to stop. And then the Russians could just think they could barrel over them. There's no need to negotiate. The Ukrainians had to stop them first. But when he says like, oh, we're going to fight, I don't know what he means by, he's like referring to like almost, it's like arrogant that Ukraine made the decision to keep fighting such a big country with 30,000 tanks. It was put in a position where it either had to just allow Russia to roll it over and just accept whatever fate was given to it, including the destruction of the Ukrainian idea, or resist. And it chose resist, and it stopped the Russians from advancing. And then it used diplomatic maneuvering in order to make allies like the United States return and make good on its promises to support Ukraine in an exact scenario like this, because it gave up its atomic arsenal, and because it is within the security interests of Europe and within the security interests of the United States, which are inextricably tied to Europe. and inextricably tied to deterrence as well. So when he talks about like, oh, well, just don't resist, I don't know, like he needed to resist to have leverage. And if he is referring instead to, well, when negotiations came around, it would have been better for Zelensky just to accept the deal. If he's referring to that, and instead of this alternative timeline, because it's kind of hard to make heads or tails of, and he's saying like, well, Zelensky should have, instead of fighting in, say, March after the initial resistance, what they've showed that they're willing to fight, they should have made a deal then. Well, then is he saying that Ukraine should have demilitarized? Ukraine should have gotten rid of all of their army? They should have given up the Donbass, given up Crimea, and put themselves in a situation where they have no physical force, no leverage, as well as no allies to help defend them. I mean, that doesn't seem like a really good deal. So when he says like Zelensky's at fault for both, you know, taking on such a big country, which I guess it was a big country that decided to do the invading, but also, I mean, it's because he decided to fight, which was necessary for him to be able to negotiate, because if he didn't, then there would be no negotiation in the first place. Fighting was a precondition for negotiation. It's crazy, man. It makes no sense. It's just blaming Zelensky for the war for completely nonsensical reasons. There's no sense tied to this.
In the end, that's a war has to be settled. So the field is interesting because it's very flat. It's great farmland, okay? It's very flat. There's no protection. The only thing that's stopping a bullet that gets shot, they can go for miles, is a human body. And they're being hit left and right. And they're losing millions of people. Young, beautiful people are dying on the battlefield, and it's got to stop.
Zelensky did say for the first time,
but the ugly ones,
that he would be open to a negotiated settlement.
He says that. He should have said that a long time ago.
You put a...
What does that mean? Like in March, in an open, what type of negotiation? I mean, it's one thing to say negotiate. It's another thing to actually negotiate a deal. Because if I say I want to negotiate and you say you want to negotiate and I say, okay, I'm willing to pay $50,000 and you say $5 billion, well, then, like, okay, we can say negotiate. We can say that talking it out and kumbaya is good in principle. But the Russians still want demilitarization. They still want Kherson. They still want Zaporizhia. They still want Kramatorsk. They still want Sloviansk, as well as everything they currently hold on to, as well as no future defensive alliance for Ukraine that could stop a future invasion. No military, no defensive alliance to stop future invasion, and grabbing land. So they would just have a launching off point to do a future invasion. And that was the offer that they were throwing out there back in 2022. That was the offer that they're still giving now, an extension of it. When they say we need to build on the Istanbul framework, they say it all the time, Istanbul framework, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the framework where Ukraine has no army, Ukraine loses its land, and Ukraine has no allies. And so what would Russia do after they've isolated Ukraine with no army and no allies? Well, that's when you would try to enter it back into your Ruski Mir. You would try to go forward with the ideological that Putin has. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe the next day. Point is, you would be leaving it open for future aggression after the Russians had illegally invaded your country like 3 or 4 times in the last decade. And when I say 3 or 4 times, I mean Crimea, I mean multiple times in the Donbass, and then the 2022 invasion. And so you're just going to get rid of your army? Your solution after not losing, but getting invaded like multiple times in a row within a very short time period is, oh, let me sign away my armed forces after we find success in combat on the battlefield, in defeating Russia in battles and making them retreat. It's like you're begging to give up leverage. This is the guy who wrote Art of the Deal. It doesn't make any sense to me. And this is why Trump is on TV right after being inaugurated, where the most people are paying attention to him. This is the moment he's choosing to say, hey, everybody, it's actually also Zelensky's fault. He's not so innocent. Why did the Ukrainians think that they could fight a big country? So it's also their fault because they fought a big country and because they weren't willing to make a deal. What that deal would look like, well, let's skip all that point. That doesn't matter. Just, they didn't make a deal.
Iran in a different category. I keep reading and I talk to my
Well,
sources.
they're religious zealots. It's different.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
When I came in, I met with Obama. Right there, we sat. And we talked. I said, what's
Also,
the big...
in this interview, he's still lying about the aid numbers, Europe versus the United States. It's like there's no bit of this that somebody could take from as an American citizen and learn about what's going on in the conflict. He's the least informative American president of I think, honestly, not of a generation ever. He dishes out the least useful information for people listening to him. Remember what C-19 was like when he was trying to inform the public on how to, like, stay safe, combat the risk, the sun would get rid of it, whatever.
biggest threat? North Korea.
You guys were yucking it up in the church.
Yeah, we
service.
were. Someday I'll tell you what we said.
Someday you'll tell
No,
me.
we had a nice time. But he said North Korea is the biggest thing. And I solved that problem. And I got along with him. He's not a religious zealot.
Will you reach
he
out to
happens
him?
to be.
Did he just say he solved that problem? He solved North Korea. Sorry, what? Back up. Back up.
And we talked. I said, what's the big zealots? It's different.
Okay. Category.
An
No, I need to hear he solved North Korea. Let me hear that again.
example, Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
When I came in, I met with Obama. Right there, we sat. And we talked. I said, what's the biggest threat? North Korea.
You guys were yucking it up in the church.
Yeah, we
service.
were. Someday I'll tell you what we said.
Someday you'll tell
No,
me.
we had a nice time. But he said North Korea is the biggest thing. And I solved that problem.
They still have nukes. In fact, not only do they have not only do they still have nukes, at the end of Trump's administration, after he pulled his fire and fury stunt, stopped military drills with the South Koreans, got nothing out of the North Koreans in negotiations, by the end of the administration, they were blowing up the South Korean liaison office on national television to signal their anger at the progress in the conversations with the Trump administration. And there would be similarly a lack of progress during the next administration, because it is the same Rubik's Cube every American president has found unsolvable. And Trump was no different, and his bold approach boldly failed. And it might have boldly failed, but it still failed. Jimmy Carter tried something similar, got a lot closer to success, still ended up failing. Now, you can blame some of that on Bill Clinton, outside of Jimmy's control, but that's a story for another day. Point is, they still have nukes. In fact, not only do they still have nukes, now they're sending troops to go fight against the allies of the United States, sending armies to invade Europe with the Russians, while also getting in return who knows what sort of technology transfers as they continue to do missile testing, and will continue to do missile testing throughout the Trump administration. So when he says he solved the issue, this is the thing I don't get with Trump. He will just approach it, say he's going to do something, not do it, and then walk away as if he solved the problem. Like, well, how can you say you solved the issue? The country's still there. It's you invite a repairman into your house, you give him $50, you say fix the hole in the ceiling. He says okay. You look at him. He looks back at you. You look at him again. He looks back at you. You look at him. You say okay, you're gonna fit it. You're gonna fix the hole. He said I'm done. You look up, the hole's still there. What do you mean you're done? No, I'm done. I fixed it. And we got to treat it seriously. We got to treat it seriously.
And I got along with him. He's not a religious zealot.
Will you reach
he
out to
happens
him?
to be a smart guy. Kim Jong-un is a smart guy.
You'll reach out to him again.
I will. Yeah.
All right, my
he
last
liked
question
me, and I got
your
along with
staff
him.
is going to kill me, and I don't want to
My
get. I
staff
have
is
friends
just
here.
fine. I'm not Obama.
You're not Joe either.
I'm not Joe. No, they had very strong rules. Obama staff too.
All right,
They
last
stopped him
question.
from speaking. And Joe, they usually didn't let him start. No, they're fair.
That's the best part of the interview right there.
This is bad. This is really bad. This is bad for a few reasons. So let's do the simplest reason first. The American people are looking to the President of the United States for guidance. They're looking to the President of the United States as he enters the White House, saying that he was going to fix the war really quick. They're looking to him to fix the war. They're looking for his advice. Many of them don't pay attention. Many of them are probably checking into the war for the first time in like years. They don't understand really what happened around Kursk. They don't understand what's going on around Vovchansk or what's going around about Pokrovsk or the situation, the very, sad situation around Tariffs because the city gets destroyed more and more and more. They don't know any of that. So they're looking at the president, they turn on the TV, and they hear him talking about how actually, well, maybe Zelensky was also at fault. Now, before, they'd be like, wait, I remember the president before, the last president was like, Zelensky's cool, he's our ally, he's being invaded. Now it's actually also his fault. He provoked it? Well, how did he provoke it? Russia's big. At that point, we just got to rely on the critical thinking skills of the American public, the same American public that voted for Donald Trump, either way, to hear him just say, well, Russia's big, and be like, well, okay, that doesn't seem like a good explanation. The 13 colonies were small. The British Empire was big. Okay? What does that mean? Vietnam, I would say North Vietnam, in comparison to the United States and South Vietnam, was very small. We did not win Afghanistan. How many times do we have to do this? How many times? Afghanistan once? Afghanistan twice? No. Afghanistan thrice. And depending on what happens in the near future, maybe even 4 times. Who knows? Point is, I just don't see Donald Trump's justification for how it's their fault because they resisted a big country. The way that Afghanistan got its independence from the Soviet Union was by fighting the bigger country. The way the Chechens won the first Chechen War was by fighting the Russians. The Russo-Japanese War. Russia as a gigantic country has lost wars, and they can lose wars. When he talks about 30,000 tanks, that'd be an impressive number if you also did not include the amount of tanks that they've lost, which could be the majority of their tank fleet. And now they're going into the scrap heap, getting tanks from 1950, from like Stalin era design tanks. And there's no need to pump up the strength of your opponent. And there's also no need for you to show like no care for your ally, which is only going to make your diplomatic opponent, which is going to be the people you're negotiating with at the other end of the table here, think you don't care, think that they can wait you out, think that the path of least resistance for the Russians, which is just to keep on pushing. It's much easier for the Russians to just try to keep on the path. Like, hey, we're making some gains around Pokrovsk. Hey, I know that we haven't been able to hit the guideline of, or hit the goal of pushing the Ukrainians out of Kursk by New Year. We have not been able to do that, but we're making some gains. And now we've seen that the Biden administration's out, we got the Trump administration in. Their base is a lot more opposed to aid. We've got people like Elon Musk in there that we got some lines to. Maybe we can push the policy away. Maybe less aid over time. Maybe not. There'll still be aid, but there'll be less aid. We can do the path of least resistance. Push on for even better terms in the future, like demilitarization, like Kherson, like Zaporizhia, or push on to total victory.
Latvia in a couple of years. Woo.
Thank you so much for the 5. I appreciate the 5er. And so, if you're putting out this mixed message of like, oh, well, Zelensky shouldn't have really resisted the big country in the first place. What's the message there? That like, at the end of the day, the West is like, Russia big, so, big country go to small country. The whole idea around NATO is a bunch of smaller countries band together to make a much bigger alliance of over 1 billion people that can stand up to a country of 160 million in the Russian Federation. So, I mean, if your principle here is going to be big country, small country, shouldn't have resisted, then, I mean, should have counted out the Finns, 41. I mean, I don't want to do any more historical analogies. I just think it's a terrible, terrible justification. And even if the Ukrainians don't win the war, surely we all understand that if they would have immediately conceded the war at the start, it would have been much worse for the Ukrainian idea, for the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty. And I mean, I still want to know what he should have negotiated in March, if he should have just demilitarized or not, and if Trump would have ever agreed to demilitarize the United States. Just that he would never accept this type of treatment to the United States, but is more than willing to push it on to Ukraine because, he just doesn't care about Ukraine. And so this is where we get to my end point. Trump has no ideological dedication to Ukrainian sovereignty. He does not care about the romantic idea of defending Ukraine's democracy. He does not care about the United States' credibility, as he is willing to enter and exit international treaties at a whim, even if it makes us appear entirely fickle, willing to tear up international treaties, whether it, for example, are now exiting of the World Health Organization, the tearing up of the Iran deal, the Paris Climate Accords. He does not care about that. He does not care about that at all. If we flip-flop, that's fine by him. So if we ask the Ukrainians to give up their atomic arsenal in return for defensive support, and then they gave up their atomic arsenal, well, we already got what we want. So what's the big deal? Now, okay, do we have to continue delivering this forever? Like, why would he care to stick out his neck to keep up that credibility in principle, or just for diplomatic reasons otherwise? He didn't care about it when it came to any of these other organizations or any of these other treaties. Why would he care about it in a special case here? And, you know, I don't know how much he's been convinced of, for example, Ukraine's deterrence effect in its connection to Taiwan. Maybe it's convinced somebody around him, like, say, Marco Rubio, who might be whispering in his ear. But Trump himself, no. No, I don't buy that. And so something else has to be sold to him in order to sell continuing to support Ukraine to the best outcome possible. And it has to be some other benefit, whether it is as simple as the American people largely support Ukraine, so if you abandon them up a creek, it's going to be very bad. But that's not good enough to get good terms. That's good enough to not be, saying take Kyiv, we don't care. That's good enough for that, but that's not the outcome the Ukrainians want. That's not the outcome I think most of my viewers or what I would want. And so it's going to have to probably be more than just that, than just hoping that the love of the American people carries through. And plus, the American people can be quite fickle with their attention, and the Republicans and the right, especially with Elon and X and now Meta, and of course Donald Trump's beautiful Truth Social, the right is dominant in the attention economy. Well, I mean, putting aside like how the election went with Joe Rogan and Kamala Harris and those podcasts, they're just dominant right now in the attention economy. And so putting it up to contest under just the terms of the attention economy, even though Zelensky is making moves in that economy, like he is with the Lex Friedman interview, is just not safe. And it's probably not enough. So that means making other offers to Trump that entices him. Either stuff that entices him personally or nationally, as in stuff that would be better for the United States. For example, offering him something that would be beneficial to him politically, like Trump, for example, was fishing for before when he was trying to get dirt on his political opponents. And remember, we're talking about Ukraine in a fight for national survival here. We're not talking about Ukraine, what's the nicest thing we can, would it be nice if they'll do what's necessary to survive as a nation state. And I think Zelensky has convinced me he will probably do the same, unless it has to come with particularly difficult political decisions. I don't want to get into that right now. My goodness. But I just don't like the other pressure that I think Zelensky's just going to have to pitch it, because I just don't see any ideological commitment. So it's going to have to be pitches like I heard, replace American troops in Europe with Ukrainian troops to reduce their troop strain. Have access to these raw minerals, United States. Have access to these contract deals. You can do future aid packages, not just as aid, but as complete loan packages. So it could be a type of a lend-lease program in its entirety. Like, these are the offers, or these are the pitches that Zelensky's going to probably have to make to keep Trump's eye on the ball if negotiations fall through. And so far, the 24-hour peace deal is long dead in the water. In fact, it's been picked up by a crane, eaten, and shat out, and is rotting on the side of the road. So now we're just going to have to wait to see if there's going to be the people around him pushing Trump in the right direction for American national security interests, or Trump's going to be able to be schmoozed enough by Zelensky in order to keep his eye on the ball, considering the likely outcome of these negotiations not succeeding, because Trump has zero dedication for the Ukrainians, for our commitments, for this on a field of, principle, or just generally. I just don't think he cares generally, unless you can make it beneficial to him or what he thinks is his interests. And so that's the next stage. Do. Oh boy.